Hi, my name is Mike, and this week I've been attending Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference virtually, watching videos online and meeting up with friends that through Zoom and other methods like that. I wanted to share some of my impressions of things that Apple has announced and just some thoughts about platforms as they're going forward. So let's get started. This year there's been a lot of changes on the Mac, both with hardware and software. First, on the software side, Apple announced macOS 11, and this is the first time in about 20 years since they've incremented the version number, which gives you a hint at how big of an upgrade this is. They redid the user interface completely on it. It looks much more rounded. Views have more opacity to them, different translucency settings and so forth, and overall, like, a lot has changed. They've redone app icons, for instance, where previously app icons would be like a more realistic looking picture of something, and now they've kind of like switched it to kind of a cross between an old Mac icon and an iOS icon, where you have this rounded rect background style. So those are definite changes with how they've made changes to the look and feel of the OS. They've also changed how apps can behave, and the big change was cross-platform apps from iOS to the Mac. There are now 3 different ways to have a cross-platform app between iOS and macOS. The first one is Catalyst, which was introduced last year and has gotten much improved this year. Now, this year's changes make it so that you can switch on this Mac optimized appearance. And this changes things like UI elements and spacing and so forth to feel more native on the Mac, and that's definitely a big improvement. Catalyst app that has this Mac optimized appearance really feels a lot more like a standard native Mac app. And so that's one way to have like a cross-platform code base between Mac and iOS. The other is with SwiftUI. Now, SwiftUI was also introduced last year, and it gives you a way to define a full interface using Swift. And this actually works really well because each platform replaces what you code up in text and in the Swift language. It replaces those with user interface elements that are native to that platform. And this works on anything from the Apple Watch all the way up to the Mac, and with the various screen sizes for each of those. And so if you start an app within SwiftUI, you can actually have a pretty reasonably consistent code base between that on the Mac and on iOS. So that's the second way you can have a cross-platform app. It's also worth mentioning that SwiftUI has some big improvements this year. The most notable is that they created a way through the app and the scenes and window groups and so forth, the new elements, to actually completely replace app delegates from Swift code into SwiftUI code. And that I see as a really big change, because that means from bottom to top you could create a nice SwiftUI app. So anyway, that's the second way that you could have cross-platform apps. The third way is actually new for this year, and it ties in with Apple's hardware announcement that they're using Apple Silicon, ARM chips, to run the next generation of Apple hardware. Now, on these machines, they're actually using the same processor architecture as iOS devices. And so that means you can actually pull an app, take it off something like an iPhone, and run it directly on the Mac without any modifications at all. And this, I mean, there's definite caveats with doing something like this, because I mean, you have the whole idea of pinching and so forth that doesn't quite translate to the Mac nearly as well with that multi-touch style and touch screen interface focus of the interface. But to be able to take an app and directly run it on a Mac because of the same processor architecture is a third way now that you can have a cross-platform app. And so it should be interesting to see how many developers keep that enabled and allow users to install their iOS apps on Macs. So that begs the question of which of these three is the best way to go if you're creating a new app. I mean, or you want to bring over an app from iOS to the Mac. And I think in general, if you're creating a new app, SwiftUI is probably the best way to go. But Catalyst is another interesting option because Apple's really pushing this. They're developing their own apps in Catalyst when it comes to things like messages and the podcast app and the stocks app and so forth. Those are all Catalyst apps. And so if they're using it for things, for their own apps, then it's something that's going to stick around for a while. And so I think it's fair to say that if you did want to bring over an app that you currently have on iOS to the Mac, that's a good way to go. So let's move on a little bit more to the hardware that they announced. Basically, they said that they're not going to be using Intel chips anymore, and this transition is going to be taking about 2 years. They still have Intel Macs that are in the pipeline that are yet to be released in this next couple of years. But within the next 2 years, all new Macs that are released or are sold are going to have Apple Silicon chips in them. Now, what does this mean? And this means that Apple has control over the processor architecture, what process they use, the manufacturing process they use for the processors, and also if they want to add like non-traditional CPU support, things for like doing Core ML work on the chip. And because of that, they actually call this an SoC, a system on the chip. It's not a CPU. A CPU is just something that does arithmetic and the standard operations, but a system on a chip pulls features from other areas like the GPU and Core ML's AI intelligent or AI logic and so forth onto this chip, and so you get a much more compact layout of the system. You won't have like huge motherboards anymore with tons of chips on them for each different part of the architecture. That doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't make sense when you develop something like an iPhone where you have a motherboard that's maybe that small. And so now Macs are going to be using these, and I think that this is a way that you can make Macs a whole lot smaller because a lot of the functionality is now going to be integrated on these system-on-chip architectures. So that's the big change. Now, what does this mean for developers? There's been a lot on this, on how much of an effect this is going to have on people who are developing Mac apps. For the most part, most things are very similar. This is not like the change from PowerPC to Intel. It's not the same magnitude of change. When you had that change, you were often going from either from 32 to 64 bits, or you had changes in the endianness of the memory mapping, and so you had little endian, switch from big endian on the PowerPC to little endian in Intel. Now, for this transition, though, the Intel chip and Apple Silicon chip both run little endian, and so that's not going to be an issue anymore. And that was actually a really big load when we did that transition 10 years ago. Or actually, it's been, well, almost 15 years ago now. So I expect that this transition will be a lot easier. Apple is allowing developers to rent hardware for the next year in the form of a DTK, a developer transition kit. And so I actually placed an order for one of these, and it's on its way. And I look forward to getting my hands on that to actually start the transition of my own apps, my own Mac apps, to the new hardware. Now, what are drawbacks of changing this architecture? The things that I'm most concerned about is virtualization and just the hardware being locked off. Now, already there's some struggles with recent Macs that have the T2 chip, and the storage, the internal SSDs that are locked behind that T2 chip. The T2 chip does things like manage the encryption and the authentication, to those devices. And that comes into play when you try to run things like VMware on the latest Macs, and you can't use internal storage. Apple doesn't expose drivers for that or any specification for that to other companies. And so I have this Mac Mini running VMware ESXi directly on it, but I cannot access the internal storage. I have to mount network-based storage via iSCSI to actually host virtual machines on that Mac. With the new Apple Silicon Macs, that's not going to be possible anymore. Apple's going to have full control over the SoCs, and I have a feeling they're not going to really open that up to other OSs like Windows with Boot Camp or something like VMware. Now, Apple is still offering some kind of virtualization, and in the form of and this is basically, you're able to virtualize. You're not emulating, you're virtualizing. And so you won't be able to run like a standard x86 version of Linux in a virtualized container, but you will be able to run Linux on ARM. There's ARM versions of Ubuntu and so forth, and that will be able to run in something like the new Macs with virtualization support. The one thing that is yet to be seen is if something like Windows on ARM will be able to be virtualized. And so this definitely won't be some kind of boot camp where you can load an x86 version of Windows on the new Mac. But if you had something where you can run it in a container and you were able to install the ARM version of Windows, then that's a possibility. I don't know if they're going to do it, but it could be done. So overall, those are my concerns with switching to the new architecture, and so with that, I think Apple's doing what they can. But I think they're looking at it from the perspective is that it's worth the trade-off to get this enhanced, to have this control over the architecture of the Mac, to be able to do a lot of operations in hardware like video encoding and so forth. Do that all in hardware, and Macs will just be way quicker and way better machines because of it. So they're making an effort to be able to run Docker containers and so forth. They're actually Apple is working with these open source projects to make sure that all this works as well as it can. And so it's not like they're being malicious with this change, but it is a drawback and it is a setback from the current state of Macs running different OSs and so forth. So yeah, that's my thoughts on what was announced this week. There's still, there's a lot of other things that were announced, changes in iOS and so forth, that are really positive improvements. I know my daughters who watched the keynote with me, they really like the new home screen widgets and so forth. That was their biggest change that they were most impressed with. And I can see myself doing coding those widgets for my own apps as time goes on. So that's something I'm excited to get my hands on as well. But overall, it's been an amazing WWDC. I do miss the interaction with people in the hallways because it's great to run into people that you know and to have those discussions to kind of exchange ideas and thoughts about what has been announced this week. But on the other hand, the sessions have just been so concise and really, really high production value. And so in that respect, it's great to be able to watch a session that's only 20 minutes long, that's all the information you need to know, instead of having them expand on things to fit into a 50-minute session format that would be in an in-person developers conference. So there's definitely been some benefits, and a lot of, if you've watched the keynote, that you'll definitely see that enhanced production value there as well. So overall, a great week. Thanks for joining me in this video. If you have any questions about stuff or comments, think I'm wrong on different takes of this, definitely leave them in the comments below. Click the like button and subscribe. Thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you in the next video.